The other part, the other half of our tier list video goes out to the range DPS. Yesterday we looked at the melee DPS by looking at how powerful they are right now in the meta, how they might look in a couple of weeks once 10.1.5 launches, together with the changes planned for 10.1.5, just in case some of those specs might become stronger, much stronger, or maybe simply better to play compared to how they are now. Now, unfortunately, not many of the changes in 10.1.5 are about melee DPS. So there isn't much change in terms of power to these specs. However, today we have the range DPS, which are the most changed out of all of the roles in 10.1.5. We have some significant changes to Balance Druid, we have some big changes to Affliction, to Demonology, to Fire, and to Frost Mage as well. So lots of changes happening in the range camp. Now this is the current situation for the range DPS. When it comes to the raid, you have an equal spread of powerful specs like Devastation, like Shadow Priest, Demolock, Arcane Mage. Meanwhile, when it comes to Mythic Plus, it's of course a little bit more streamlined in favor of Shadow Priest. And then Balance Druid, but mostly because of other powerful features of Balance Druid like the utility and even the combat rest they bring now, especially with the loss of Protection Paladin being super meta over Vengeance Demon Hunter, for example. Still, you also have Devastation Evoker still being a prevalent pick in Mythic Plus, as well as the rise of Fire Mage compared to Arcane, which in Mythic Plus compared to the raid goes all the way down. You do have some similarities, like for example Affliction or Marksmanship, for example, which are at the bottom in both activities, not just Mythic Plus but also the raid as well. So let's see what is actually changing, if anything might change for the range DPS with 10.1.5 coming in a couple of resets. The first in line are the changes to balance, which look quite long, look quite filled with stuff. The reality is that a lot of this stuff is once again due to the mana changes of hybrid specs. So what actually changes for Balance Druid are a few cool things. Now, unfortunately, it won't net in much of a damage boost, in much of a damage gain. It's mostly to smoothen your rotation, to improve your rotation, provided you are one of the moon enjoyers. So, if you like playing around with new moon, half moon and full moon, this will be the more damaging, the better damage profile for Balance Druid in 10.1.5. So that will give you basically an extra button, they will give you an extra feature to use in your rotation, as well as being the higher damage rotation for Balance Druid. So that's the main improvement of balance in 10.1.5. You know, if you haven't tried Balance Druid in a while, now with these changes perhaps you might try something different compared to before. So it's a good choice for balance. It's not that, as we have seen, Balance Druid is doing particularly badly at the moment. They are doing amongst the better in terms of range DPS picks in Mythic Plus, and they are still a pretty solid pick in the raid as well. Once more, it's weird once we go and look at the actual performance in the raid, and Balance Druid is towards the bottom. But in terms of popularity, in terms of the amount of players playing balance, they are still doing quite fine. So this change will only improve the situation of Balance Druids in 10.1.5, so it's a pretty safe pick. If you were thinking about trying another spec, another range spec in 10.1.5, balance seems a pretty solid choice at the moment. Now, the next in-line spec is Devastation. Now, Devastation receives one of the fewest amounts of changes of all of the specs, because besides the, once more, mana changes for the spec, the only change is reducing their mastery by 20%, the scale at which they gain mastery, meaning they now do less burst damage to full HP or high HP targets, while in return they gain 6.5% more damage overall. So they get a higher average damage done throughout the whole, the whole boss encounter, the whole key level and whatnot, but slightly lower burst, because their mastery is now worth less. Also, you can still drop more mastery in favor of other stats to make this nerf in mastery less relevant. Now, Devastation is also doing quite well right now. It's amongst the better picks in Mythic Plus, and also one of the, if not the better pick in the raid. So Devastation is doing quite well right now in the raid. In Mythic Plus, yeah, sure, in Mythic Plus there is still the gap to bridge with Shadow Priest, of course, but they're still not that terrible by any means in Mythic Plus, and this change in 10.1.5 won't really make them weaker or make them lose their value over time, so you're still pretty fine if you were thinking about playing Devastation. Considering their current position in the meta, Devastation is a pretty safe pick in 10.1.5. Where things go a little bit out of the window when talking about safety are for Mage, because these are all of the planned changes for Mage. These are just to the general tree of Mage, and then you also have to think about some of the changes to Arcane, and then even more so the big rework that is happening to Fire Mage, and after that there is the big rework happening to Frost Mage. So it's very difficult to actually gauge the power of these specs and how they will come out of the PTR, given how large these changes are going to be. Now, we know, for example, that Blizzard, at least, according to Blizzard, they thought they were too powerful. So powerful that just recently they had to be nerfed in the PTR to most of their abilities, because this rework, according to the devs, was making the specs too strong. Fire was nerfed, and then Frost was nerfed by a similar amount to pretty much all of their abilities. So at the moment, the worst of the two is definitely Frost. You know, Frost and Fire are both middling when it comes to the raid, even though we are seeing at the moment Fire Mage doing quite well, but definitely not as good as Arcane, that is currently doing much better. And then in Mythic Plus, it's reversed. In Mythic Plus, you still have Frost being middling, but now you have the swap. Now it's Arcane that's worse and Fire that's better. So with this 10.1.5 set of changes, I would say in general, it's a very good time to go and play Mage. Regardless of how Blizzard will tune the specs, it's still at the very least a good thing for you to try, given the amount of changes happening to both Fire and Frost, and some of the changes also happening to Arcane. So it's just nice. It's just something new that is happening to the spec, a rework, changing a lot of the things, even things in their general tree, not just to each individual specs. So it's perhaps the better time for you to be trying Mage, especially if you were one of the players who got bored, right? Who got bored of the state of Fire Mage in the past couple of tiers, or 2 or 3 tiers even from the last expansion. Same goes for Frost. If you were bored at the 2-button playstyle of Frost, etc, etc, this patch 10.1.5 might be the best case for you to be trying out Mage again. And it pains me to say because I don't want to see any more Mage players, but you know, truth be told, right now would be a pretty good time to try out Mage. Now, after the Mages, you do have, down the line, you have Priest with Shadow Priest. Now, Shadow Priest is receiving borderline 0 changes. Once more, they have a whole bunch of mana pool changes as a hybrid spec, but in terms of performance, they have just gotten nerfed in their AoE and slightly in their single target. Their situation right now is excellent because they are the top pick when it comes to one of the top picks when it comes to the raid, and unquestionably the top pick when it comes to Mythic Plus. They are vastly the more dominant of the picks in Mythic Plus when it comes to ranged, and then in the raid, as I said, they are still doing very well. They are also still very popular, as you see here, one of the more popular picks. Yes, they still have weaknesses. Yes, once you look at the boss damage, the single target damage, Shadow Priest is, you know, average, it's middling, but overall it's still a very solid spec. So nothing wrong with you being a couple of months late to the flavor of the month train if you wanted to try Shadow Priest out in this new patch. Talking about trying something out, we have the Forgotten Child, we have Elemental Shaman. So Elemental Shaman, once more, doesn't really get any planned changes in 10.1.5 besides the mana regen and mana pool changes. Now, Elemental Shaman is somewhat middling in the raid. This mostly is sort of a little bit mean because it's not that much of a popular spec, but once you look at the few specs playing Elemental, you know, the damage of Elemental is not that poor. Yes, you could be saying technically it's worse than 1, 2, 3, 4 different other ranged classes, and you know, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 range classes, so being worse than 4 out of the 6 available means you are basically one of the worst. But you know, besides that, in the raid it's not that terrible. Where it gets a little bit worse is in Mythic Plus, where it's also not very I mean, how do you call this? it's not very represented in Mythic Plus. Even in the 20 key range, not even going super high, Elemental is actually one of the least represented specs. So you might have been thinking, you might have been hoping for some changes in 10.1.5 to Elemental. They are not coming. Nothing really is changing for the spec, so only if you were a niche, hipster, contrarian, alternative, rebellious type of player who wanted to say no, I'm gonna show you that Elemental is actually good under some circumstances, then you can go ahead and try out Elemental for the upcoming patch. But right now, there isn't much hope for the spec to be improving out of nowhere without any significant changes to the spec. We are once more, much like we did for survival for hunters, we're also skipping hunters because there is no change happening to hunters in 10.1.5. This is somewhat sad because at the moment both of the hunters are quite mediocre to bad in the raid, and both of the specs are quite average to bad in Mythic Plus. So if you wanted some help in particular for Marksmanship Hunter, that's not coming. They received a hotfix buff a few days ago, and that's the only thing that Hunters will be getting. So, much like Elemental and a few of the other specs not receiving many changes, that's gonna be their situation in 10.1.5 as well. I am sure, even if I am telling you don't bother playing Hunters right now because they are not that powerful, many of you will ignore me. Why? Because history teaches us that no matter the state of Hunter will still be quite the popular spec in both Raid and Mythic Plus, regardless of their power level. So yeah, completely pointless telling you not to play Hunter. You are going to be playing Hunter anyways, and you will suck anyways, and you will keep playing Hunter anyways. So let's move along to the last of the classes, which is Warlock. So Warlock is receiving quite a decent amount of changes to Affliction, and then way bigger changes to Demonology, and barely anything to Destruction, but that barely anything is quite important. Now, the changes to Affliction are actually good. The problem is that the level from which Affliction starts and the amount of buffs they need to start to become actually good is too large. So even if these buffs are good, in particular to have a faster setup as Affliction and to do more upfront damage and not take every time 6 years to set up all of your dot damage, is actually good. Unfortunately, at the moment Affliction is amongst the weakest performers in the raid and still one of the weakest performers in Mythic Plus. So they need more than just those tiny buffs. So technically, yes, the buffs are promising, but technically, no, they are not really going to change anything in how underplayed and underrepresented Affliction is. Where we have much larger changes are to Demo. Now, this whole list of changes, the TLDR, is attempting to slow down the degenerate playstyle of Demonology, where they have peaks of 3, 4, 5, 600,000 DPS, and then they have lows of sub-tank damage. So Blizzard is trying to increase the overall damage of Demo and to not make them nearly as reliant on big, huge cooldown windows. They will still keep their cooldown windows. Their cooldown windows are still strong, and with everything you can still pile on top of each other as a Warlock. Your Nether Portal, your Golden Ambition, your Reign of Tyranny, your Power Infusion, you still have ways to have big burst windows, but now many of these changes are going to be making your overall rotation feel a little bit better. Feel like you're not doing sub-tank damage. So the changes overall are very positive for Demonology. Now, was there need for it? No. In terms of the performance, not really. Demo had one of those classic divides. Very good spec in the raid, top spec in terms of performance in the raid. Even here, top performing spec, even in terms of popularity, they're still doing quite well. And then kinda shit in Mythic Plus. In Mythic Plus, Demo is, still doing okay at the average level of high keys, and then once you go very high, they disappear. Warlocks disappear completely. So, not that great in Mythic Plus, much better in the raid. These changes would actually make them slightly better in Mythic Plus with more consistent damage, but not really by massive amounts. So as a Warlock in particular, as a demo Warlock in particular, you're still going to be doing, and you're still going to be more focused on being better in the raid. Now the other side of buffs looks very small because it's just this tiny little thing for destruction. This is actually a pretty important change for Destro because it gives much more value to your Summon Inferno. For a while now, Destro has not been like the old days of like the end of BFA or even mid Shadowlands, where a lot of the damage was front-loaded on your Infernals as a Destro, or even the Abomination that became Destro in Season 3 of Shadowlands, where tons of damage was around Infernals and your Infernal window. In Dragonflight, that was not the case. In Dragonflight, Destro kind of went flat in terms of damage. They became the exact opposite of Demo. Demo was mountains and then plains and then mountains and then plains, where, you know, a high rise above water line, all constant, all straight. Now with this change, you can put more value and more damage and more burst inside summoning your Inferno. So it's improving the damage profile of Destro. Not necessarily giving you more damage, not necessarily giving you more DPS, but making your damage profile a little bit better. Kind of what has been going on with Demo, also trying to make the damage profile a little bit more smooth, except in the reverse of Destro. Demo is trying to have less burst and more constant damage. Destro is trying to have more burst and less constant damage. That's the change for Destro. Overall, I would say same judgment as for Mage. If you were thinking about playing a spec in a couple of weeks for the release of 10.1.5, maybe looking forward to Season 3, Warlocks are also looking good, similar to Mage. Mostly because of the changes they are receiving, the amount of options that it might open up, or the changes that it might open up in their playstyle in the near future once the patch hits. More so than some of the other specs which won't really be changed by much, like Devastation, like SPriest, like Arcane Mage, like Balance Druid. These other specs, Fire Mage, Frost Mage, Demo, Destro, might become more enjoyable to play, more satisfying to play compared to before, so they might be worth giving it a try for this upcoming patch. So overall, compared to the melee DPS, we definitely have way more possible interesting changes when it comes to the range DPS, particularly centered around Warlocks and Mages this time around. It might be a little bit sad, since Warlocks and Mages are already the prime staple pure DPS picks of the range DPS, so you might have wanted to see some more changes, maybe some more changes to Elemental Shamans, for example, maybe the two Hunter specs not doing nearly as well, but that's what we have planned right now for 10.1.5, now coming live in a couple of weeks. So this was the recap for the ranged, after going through the melee DPS as well. I have a couple of ideas in mind for my next range DPS to play. Who am I kidding? The only range DPS I'll be playing is Augmentation Evoker, if we want to call it a DPS. So besides this is all we have for today on this Wednesday. Thanks, of course, as usual, once more to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which you can still help grow completely for free. You can like and comment down below to help with the YouTube algorithm. You can also subscribe to the channel itself, and those are still completely free ways to support. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow probably, and in the meantime, weird. I had in my mind this idea that we were receiving way more changes in this patch. Apparently I was wrong.